There is a drug that has completely swept through the world. In exchange for a short high, your teeth yellow and rot. Being peddled by large and powerful groups, you become dependent on it as it touches every facet of your life. And that drug is sugar. You thought I was going to say vapes there, or weed, or meth. Funny how all of these have so much in common. Obviously, escalating in severity, but still strange. The world is full of drugs. Some good, some bad. Some people can't live without drugs. Some people can't live with drugs. So, how do we distinguish these drugs? Why are some drugs considered illegal? And what could a better relationship with drugs look like in the future? Don't do drugs. This video is not an endorsement of drugs. Dependencies can arrive very quickly in those who are prone to addiction, and you don't know if you're that type until you've already crossed the line. Just don't do drugs. Okay, so disclaimer out the way, let's break down what a few different definitions of drugs are. The most common and most vague definition is a chemical in which, when exposed to your body, has a physiological effect. And that definition is so broad, it includes pretty much everything like sugar, fat, protein. Like, these things are chemicals, and when exposed to your body, have an effect on it. So it's a drug. So what isn't a drug? Let's try and find a definition of drug which fits the more colloquial term. It's got to encapsulate a range from penicillin all the way over to heroin. These are what people would typically call drugs, not sugar. And I think I've got one. A drug, in the more colloquial term, is a chemical when administered to the body has an intended effect beyond general maintenance. This does mean that once you become dependent on a drug, such that you need to administer it as part of maintaining homeostasis, the bodily functions that keep you ticking over, it's no longer a drug, in the same way that sugar isn't a drug. This casts a very different light on drugs as a whole. But before we look at the implications of such a definition, let's take a brief look into the past at ancient and prehistoric drugs. Humans love drugs. We love them now, and we've loved them forever. The problem with looking for prehistoric drugs using our definition is that it's all about intention. And seeing as in prehistory they didn't write anything down, we just can't know what their intentions were with any sort of drugs they may have been taking. However, what we do know is that humans are curious to a fault and will eat everything. So if there were some, say, hallucinogenic mushrooms that humans found, they were probably eating them. But for it to be a drug, we would know that they were consuming them specifically for the hallucinogenic effects, which we don't. Ancient drugs, however, we do know a lot about. From the year 3100 BCE, we have written records, finally. Evidence of various substances used for medicinal and recreational purposes. One of the most prominent examples is the use of alcohol across different cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, beer was consumed daily and was seen as a gift from the gods. It played an essential role in social gatherings and religious rituals, highlighting its importance in human connection and community. Another ancient drug, cannabis, has roots that stretch back thousands of years. Used in China for medicinal purposes around the year 2700 BCE, it was also incorporated into spiritual practices across various cultures. The psychoactive properties of cannabis were very well known, and its use was often tied to rituals aimed at connecting to the divine. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient drug use was shamanism. Shamans, often viewed as spiritual leaders and healers, utilized hallucinogenic substances like peyote, ayahuasca, and psilocybin mushrooms to enter altered states of consciousness. These experiences were believed to facilitate communication with the spirit world and provide guidance for their communities. This reverence for certain drugs suggests that ancient cultures had a nuanced understanding of the relationship between substances and spirituality. It's evident that throughout history, drugs have been embraced for their ability to enhance experiences, alleviate suffering, and foster social bonds. But alongside this embrace, there has also been a recurring theme of caution and control. As societies evolved, so did the regulations surrounding drug use. The transition from acceptance to prohibition often stemmed from the recognition of addiction and the potential societal consequences of unchecked substance use. This duality, celebration and condemnation, continues to shape contemporary discussions about drugs. As we navigate these complex relationships, it becomes vital to understand the historical context that informs our current views. So what's going on here? Why have cultures throughout history both embraced drugs and fought against them? The answer lies in a mix of cultural practices, societal values, and the evolving understanding of health and well-being. So let's skip forward a bit to a more recent history. The war on drugs, as a distinct American operation, was a campaign initiated in the 70s by then-president at the time, Richard Nixon. However, the war had been brimming away long before then. In the early 20th century, substances like opium and cocaine were commonplace in medicine, utilized for pain relief and other ailments. However, as addiction rates surged, societal fears led to a criminalization of these substances. The Harrison's Narcotic Act of 1914 in the United States marked a significant turning point, regulating and restricting access to opiates and narcotics. Fast forward to the 70s, where Nixon formally declared a war on drugs. The initiative aimed to reduce illegal drug use through aggressive law enforcement and punitive measures. This resulted in heightened penalties for drug offences and a significant increase in incarceration rates, particularly affecting marginalised communities. The war was waged not only against drugs, but also against people who use them, leading to systemic issues within the justice system. The war on drugs has been widely criticised, and rightly criticised in my opinion, for its ineffectiveness and disproportionate impact on communities of colour. I argue that the focus on punishment over rehabilitation has perpetuated cycles of poverty, addiction, and incarceration. Furthermore, the stigma surrounding drugs has led to a culture of silence, preventing individuals from seeking help and support. See, laws are threats made by the dominant socio-economic ethnic group in a given nation. It's just a promise of violence that's enacted. And the police are basically an occupying army. You get what I mean? So, if the dominant group wants to attack other ideologies to enforce their own, they can do so through means of legislation and terror. For example, the Dewi Goa in 1040 BCE, apologies for my pronunciation, in what would become modern China, heavily restricted the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol, aside from ritual practices like taking sacramental wine. And this sounds an awful lot like the Prohibition Act in the 20s, but it really was in the 70s that shit hit the fan for drug law. The war was truly on. Of course, there's lots to talk about with the controversies and conspiracies surrounding the war on drugs. Racially discriminatory searches, increases in drug use, the CIA pushing fentanyl through poor black neighborhoods as a means of culling numbers through ODs, increasing prison workforce, lowering neighborhood energy as a means of domination and oppression. The list truly goes on. But I want to talk about the warped relationship that we have developed with drugs. Drug reoffending rates are high. Drug-related violence is high. Overdoses are high. Drug addiction is high. Petty crime is high. Poverty is high. All of these issues can be addressed, some by a greater margin than others, by simply decriminalizing and regulating drugs. But why did the war on drugs fail? Well, primarily because it was never intended to succeed. Instead, it was a means of oppression against poverty, but also because criminalization is the true gateway drug. We said it. Every PSHE teacher's favourite word, gateway drugs. Classically put, if somebody enjoys consuming less severe drugs, they are more likely to pursue more severe drugs. However, this is not what the data shows. Rather, the data shows that once somebody has crossed the line into criminal drugs, their disregard for the law becomes an easier line to cross again, and cross further. Let me explain with an example. Cannabis in the UK is illegal for recreational use. So in order for a customer to score, they have to break the law. Once they cross that line, they replace it with something of their own machinations. A personal line that they won't cross. The whole, I've smoked weed, but I'd never take cocaine. But since the law is no longer of consequence to their decision making, this attitude is very much subject to change. To push that line past cocaine is now just down to a whim. However, in certain countries, and some states in the US, cannabis is legal. And therefore, when someone smokes up, they haven't yet crossed that line. And their respect for the law is more likely to remain intact. Another aspect of how criminalization is the real gateway drug is in how dealers operate. 9 times out of 10, a dealer sells more than just one type of drug. They might sell weed, coke, ket, molly, etc. So when a customer gets their phone number, they will receive weekly or even daily menus displaying drugs of all kinds, incentivizing them to push the boat out even further. There are plenty of videos on YouTube outlining how destructive the war on drugs has been, and how criminalization doesn't reduce consumption rates. Rather, it pushes people into the predacious illegal drug market, increasing addiction rates and weighing a huge burden on the public health sector. However, on the bright side, the past decade has seen a shift towards a slightly more progressive approach to drug policy. Countries like Portugal have decriminalized drug use, focusing instead on harm reduction strategies and prioritizing public health over criminal justice. This approach has been linked to a decrease in drug-related deaths, like ODs and violent drug crime, gangs fighting each other, and a decrease in HIV transmission among intravenous drug users. As we look towards the future in Britain, a better relationship with drugs could involve a comprehensive reevaluation of our policies and attitudes. By focusing on education, prevention, and rehabilitation, we can create an environment that fosters an understanding rather than fear. The narrative surrounding drugs must shift from one of vilification to one of informed choice, recognizing the complexities of human behavior and the role of socioeconomic factors. Drugs have been intertwined with human history for millennia, and our relationship with them is far from simple. By examining the past and acknowledging the failures of the war on drugs, we can pave the way to a more compassionate and effective approach to drug use and addiction in the future. So we need to decriminalize and regulate all drugs. We can't just do weed by itself, otherwise you're going to have all the same problems with coke, ket, molly, heroin, all of these other really harmful drugs. To fully decriminalize a drug means to take away the penalty for possession, consumption, production, and sale. However, to decriminalize and regulate drugs, regulations are placed on all of those aspects. For example, in Amsterdam, where cannabis is famously decriminalized and regulated. Possession. In Amsterdam, there is a legal limit of how much weed in grams you can have on your person at any given time. Consumption. In Amsterdam, you cannot simply smoke weed on the streets. There are designated weed cafes and bars and establishments designed to accommodate those consuming. It is only in these establishments that consumption is allowed. The quantity you consume on site is up to the establishment's discretion, and much like a pub in the UK, they have the right to refuse service to the profusely drunk or the profusely high. Production. If the cannabis you produce is to be sold, permits are of course required. However, for personal use, there is a maximum amount of plants you can own. Sale. This is the most tightly regulated aspect of cannabis law in Amsterdam. It is also very highly taxed, which brings in a lot of revenue for the government to reinvest into welfare and infrastructure. When I say the easy way to address the issues I mentioned earlier, drug use, violence, overdoses, etc., is to decriminalize and regulate them, that simply does not mean allowing illegal drug rings that plague our nation to continue. No, it's to provide a safe alternative to their customers. Illegal drugs are cut with additives and fillers. They are impure and callously produced. They are dangerous. Regulated drugs, on the other hand, are pure or use safe fillers and additives. They'll be tested and released like any medicine that you'd buy. They are kept behind counters, behind GP appointments, and behind bodily and physiological evaluation. And the best part is that the taxpayer does not need to pay for this. In fact, the revenue brought in by legalizing cannabis in the UK and bringing just 80% of customers out of the shadow market into the real economy would bring in huge numbers. Look, I'm not advocating for people to be taking heroin in the streets without fear of prosecution. People are already taking heroin in the streets. That's the issue. I am advocating for a public health approach for drugs, not a criminal approach. Look, we already have methadone to help addicts come off heroin. Why aren't there safe channels for those to come off all drugs without fear of police intervention? So let's talk about what kind of regulations we could have on all these kinds of drugs. My best attempt at this kind of policy would be to have a system like Amsterdam for the less damaging drugs, like cannabis, alcohol, and MDMA. I believe these drugs are safe to consume in moderation. Keeping that moderation should be up to the liberty of the consumer, but mental health professionals should be available to those who need it. For harsher drugs such as cocaine, ketamine, weaker opiates, psychedelics like acid, mushrooms, ayahuasca, 2CB, and DMT, these should all be tightly regulated. Still available to be consumed by adults at their liberty, but only consumed at certain establishments where a health professional is present during the consumption. You cannot buy some and take it home with you. Everything you buy must be consumed on site, and a health professional has every right to refuse service to you. Once the drug is consumed, you may leave the establishment, but you might not want to, as these won't just be like GPs. These establishments could well be bars, cafes, clubs, stadiums, so long as the health professional is the bartender, so to speak, and plenty of security and emergency aid is present. That's fine. But we already have security and emergency aid at most stadiums, so all we need is another dude. For the extremely dangerous and damaging drugs such as heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, etc., the consumption of these drugs will be the most tightly regulated. They will follow systems that resemble what we already have in place for heroin, for the obvious exception that breaking these policies in matters of personal use will not result in jail time, but further medical examination and mental health support. And if it comes to it, of course, the health sector has the power to section the extremely unwell, which is technically a form of imprisonment, so you got me there. However, the focus here should be on harm reduction. By creating safe spaces for consumption, we can minimize the risks associated with drug use. It is essential to ensure that individuals are educated about the substances they are consuming, the potential side effects, and the signs of overdose. This knowledge empowers users to make informed choices and seek help when needed. Education plays a crucial role in the regulation of drug use. Instead of demonizing substances, we should foster an environment where individuals can discuss their experiences openly. Schools and communities should provide comprehensive drug education that covers the spectrum of substances, including their effects, risks, and realities of addiction. By doing so, we can shift the narrative from fear-based tactics to informed decision-making. We should encourage research into the therapeutic benefits of some illegal drugs. Many drugs have shown promise in treating mental health conditions, chronic pain, and other medical issues. For instance, psychedelics like psilocybin and MDMA have shown to have potential in treating PTSD and depression. By regulating these substances, we can unlock their potential while ensuring safety and efficacy through controlled environments. The future of drug policy should focus on decriminalization and regulation. I'm going to say it again. Prioritizing public health over punishment. By keeping drugs out of the hands of dangerous criminal networks and into regulated environments, we can reduce harm, foster healthier communities, and create a more compassionate approach to substance use. The war on drugs has failed. Let's move towards a system that prioritizes safety, education, and support for all. Now, there's so much to say about drug laws and how they perpetuate all kinds of inequalities, but the simple matter of the fact that bringing customers out of the black market, out of dangerous drug production tactics, out of fear back into real life where they can trust their sources, contribute towards an economy, and seek professional help whenever they need it, has the capacity to bring great things for us individually and as a society. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.